Thank you everyone for coming along for the second of the Truths Talks in June. We thought we should try and go ahead in June. There'll be maybe normality in September for talks, but this is the June programme, and this is the second of 4 talks, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Julian Litten, who's going to tell us a bit about a forgotten Lynn architect, Guy Dawber, who lived in the town and became very well known indeed, and so I'm looking forward to hearing. Julian has told me about him in the past, but I'm looking forward to be reminded and refreshed about this very important architect, not just locally, but in England. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. How kind. Today's talk is that which could be described as a taster, or as some scholars might say, a work in progress. This is because Dawber's architectural practice is still in existence, and as such, all of his architectural drawings remain in copyright. The same applies for the record photographs of the buildings themselves, and unfortunately, of the 3 known portraits of the man. But that said, I trust that what I have to say will encourage you all to look further into his work. And if you're ever in the Cotswolds, Pevsner in hand, you will be rewarded by seeing a positive feast of his works. Towards the end of 2020, a green plaque appeared on the facade of the Minster Vicarage in St Margarets Place, recording it as the birthplace of Sir Guy Dawber, architect and past president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. This cube house, which is to say a building 3 bays wide, 3 bays deep and 3 stories high, in buff red brick, was built in about 1821 by Matthew Dawber, a King's Lynn merchant. Unfortunately, little is known of Matthew Dawber's specific trade. A merchant of what, one asks. But we do know that he was one of the town's citizens who gave evidence to the 1833 Royal Commission on the current state of the King's Lynn Corporation, a particular corporation which could be described today as conflicts of interest. Reform was required. For all of its 17 councillors, 7 were members of the Everard family, 4 of the Hogg family, 3 of the Baggs, and 3 of the Selfs, and many of these were interrelated by marriage. As for Dawber himself, Edward Guy Dawber was born on the 3rd of August 1861, the youngest son of John Stockdale Dawber and his wife Louise Ellen Edwards. Educated at King's Lynn Grammar School, at that time occupying the building in Saturday Marketplace, formerly known as the Shambles, and being almost opposite his own home, he was articled in 1881 for 4 years to the local King's Lynn architect William Adams of Adams and Son. Not an architectural practice with an enormous amount of work, I'm afraid to say. Their only recorded building was that of the 1884 Stanley Library in St James's Road, on whose plans no doubt Dawber played a small part. Be that as it may, in 1885, chance took him to Ireland, where he became an assistant in the Dublin offices of Sir Thomas Deane, spending his spare time in measuring and drawing the fine Georgian buildings of that city. He had only been there a year when political troubles caused an interruption in new building projects, and the Land League riots forced him back to England to look for work. And rather than return to Norfolk, he went, sensibly, to London with a roll of drawings under his arm, and was fortunate enough to join the staff of Sir Ernest George in 1886, an architect who by then had established a reputation as a designer of imposing mansions in the country and picturesque houses in the West End of London, and his office became noted as a nursery of genius. In his evenings at this period, and on Ernest George's recommendation, Dawber attended the Royal Academy schools to train as a professional architect. His first date of being at the school we know to be the 3rd of July 1886. However, Dawber had not been in George's office for more than 18 months when overwork strained his eyes, and he was deputed to serve as clerk of works for Batsford Park Gloucestershire, an enormous house in the Cotswolds, Elizabethan style, designed by Ernest George for A.B. Freeman Mitford, later 3rd Lord Ruysdael, who was formerly a diplomat in the Far East. Now this was a golden opportunity for Dawber, and he was, forever after that, an assiduous student of stone buildings as practised in the Cotswolds. Guy had taken lodgings in the neighbouring village of Bourton on the Hill, in the vicinity of Batsford, from late 1887 until 1893, when the main house itself was finished. However, this apparent interruption to his career proved, in fact, to be his opportunity, for he applied himself with his usual zest to an intensive study of the beautiful but then little-known domestic architecture of the Cotswolds. Soon he decided to begin practice on his own account in that delightful district, and in 1890 he hired a room in the Bourton-on-the-Hill Village Institute at the expensive rent of 9pence a week. It was at about this time that he dropped the use of Edward as his first name, adopting that of Guy, his second name. Dawber was not unknown to Bourton-on-the-Hill, for in 1889, while supervising the works at Batsford Park, he was commissioned to restore the chancel of the village church of St. Lawrence, and also to design a pulpit for it, which I'm pleased to say is still there. During his long career, Dawber was responsible for working on 27 buildings in Gloucestershire, quite a number. And having set up his little office at Bourton, small commissions came to him at once. Indeed, the requests were so many that he decided in 1891 to close his Bourton office in the Village Institute and take up practice in London, renting an office at 22 Buckingham Street, Strand. 1896 was an important year for him, as it was then that he married Mary Eccles of Lancashire and also became a member of the Art Workers Guild. He remained a member of that influential group until 1930. And 5 years after his arrival in the metropolis, after his marriage to the sister of the architect Thomas Edward Eccles, isn't recorded there how it was that they met. It may well have been through the Royal Academy schools, but we do not know. Thomas Millward Wilson joined him as an assistant in 1901 and stayed for 9 years, being succeeded by Oliver Frederick Savage, who was taken on in 1910 to oversee Caldecott, Morton in the Marsh, a small country house with a large lodge built for Milne Barnsley. And Dawber returned to Morton in the Marsh in 1921 to design the village war memorial. And later on it was Savage who became Dawber's head draftsman. That was in about 1914. And with an apprentice architect, Robert Carruthers Ballantyne. In 1922, Dawber formed a partnership with Edwin Herbert Horsley Williams, who was to remain in that practice until Dawber's death in 1938. And from that date, we're thinking here 1896, up to the time of his death in 1938, a steady stream of attractive designs, especially though not exclusively for stone-built country houses, flowed from his versatile and painstaking pencil, varying in style from Tudor to late Stuart. He designed only 2 major urban buildings, the London and Lancashire Fire Office in Pall Mall in 1906, and the low-profile Ford Arms Houses at Rochester, Kent in 1926. His largest commission was the extensive Lord Wandsworth Agricultural College at Long Sutton in Hampshire, beginning in 1915 and designing additions to it up to the time of his death in 1938. And one of his buildings, which you may well have visited, is the Reptile House at London Zoo, which opened in 1927. They have quite a large boa constrictor there with the nickname Guy. Now, whether or not that's because of Dawber, I doubt me, but it's an interesting creature to see. The list of his domestic works is both long and impressive, being the favoured country house architect of the then Nouveau Riche. He designed and converted Netherswell Manor, Gloucestershire, for Sir John Murray Scott in 1903, Ainford Park, also in Gloucestershire, in 1911 for John Cheetham, both being near Stow-on-the-Wold. It was during this time that Dawber turned his attention to garden design and landscaping, becoming a sort of Gertrude Jekyll in his own right. His best known work being the gardens at Wormington Grange, Broadway in Gloucestershire, which he created in 1919 for Mr. and Mrs. H.G. Clegg, the then owners of the rather fine 18th century manor house. And Dawber also found time to publish a number of books on vernacular architecture, his most popular being Old Cottages, Farmhouses and Other Stone Buildings in the Cotswolds district, which was published by Batsford in 1905, quite a good publishing house at that time for anybody who was involved in the study of architecture. Other houses by Dawber, of which he designed many, include Bowling Green at Millport, Somerset, 1914, an elegant Cotswold vernacular building, H-shape in plan, and with almost every room panelled. He also designed the stables, which by this time was becoming a passé requirement for a country house, most clients preferring a motor garage. Interestingly, Dawber was only asked once to design a church, and this was in 1896, and the building was St John the Baptist at Matlock Dale in Derbyshire. In truth, it wasn't a church per se, rather it was an elegant little chapel built in the garden of a house named The Rocks at Matlock Dale, constructed at the behest of a Mrs. Louisa Sophia Harris, the wife of the solicitor Walter Nell Harris, as a memorial to her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. John Greaves, with whom she had lived at the Rocks since a teenager, and the building and estate which she inherited from them. Now, the real reason for her building the chapel was that she didn't feel able to express her Anglo-Catholic sentiments at Matlock's parish church of St Giles. But probably the real reason was that she was unwilling to travel the 1¼ miles from her home to the parish church. Perhaps the most unusual item in the building is a monument under the westernmost south window, which reads, "In loving memory of Vida." But Vida was not a person, rather it was Louisa Harris's dog. It's not quite in accordance with canon law, but in an unconsecrated chapel, as it remains, she could more or less put up whatever she wanted. The only other monuments in the building are those to her aunt and uncle, and herself and her husband. Matlock Dale was Dawber's 5th new build project. It featured in the Builder's Journal in April 1901, and this is what they had to say. Care was taken in designing this delightful little chapel to make it appear to grow naturally out of the wall below, and to get the effect of clinging to the side of the hill. The selected contractors were Parnell and Sons of Rugby, though later additions were made by the Matlock builders J and W Lewis, in conjunction with craftsmen from London and elsewhere. Its walls and roof are of local stone, great blocks forming the lower part of the wall, which comes down to the road. The result is most successful. The coloured east window is by Mr. Louis Davies, the figures round the pulpit by Cecil Fabian, the plaster ceiling by George Bankart, the decorations and painted altarpiece by Mr. John Cook. Quite a good selection of arts and crafts architects working at that particular time. When they talk about the walls of the church coming down to the road, I should explain that the house itself was elevated by about 20 feet from above the road itself, because the road itself had been made as a cutting through chalk rock face. And so when you stand in that road, you get this amazing impression of looking up some 30 or 40 feet to this very exquisite little chapel. tiny. It's probably no larger than the north chancel aisle of St Nicholas's. Of the artists that were chosen, Louis Davis had trained in stained glass under Christopher Wall. The theme of the east window at Matlock is water, and it depicts baptism, the waters of death, communion, and the water of life. George Bankart, who executed the plaster ceiling, often worked with Dawber and went on to write The Art of the Plasterer in 1908, which remains the standard work of reference on the subject. He also revived decorative leadwork and subsequently joined the Bromsgrove Guild. As for Cecil Fabian, he was the son of a Winchester ironmonger, and how one would like to see the bronze figures he made for the pulpit, but I'm afraid they were stolen some 20 years ago. And this beautiful and romantic little building was licensed for worship by the Bishop of Southall in June 1897, it being noted that the internal fittings had been carried out with no regard to cost, and unlike other churches in the area, and of course the generosity of Louisa Harris, masses were celebrated there daily by the end of the century, the Sunday services being accompanied by a paid choir. As a private chapel, Louisa Harris bequeathed the building and the grounds in which it stood to the Reverend J.W. Cooley, rector of Matlock, and his successors in perpetual trust to be used as a Church of England chapel, with the Bishop of Southall and the rural dean as trustees. She also left £10,000, the interest from which was to pay a clergyman and for the church's upkeep, thus allowing Dawber to return 30 years later, in December 1929, to oversee the decorative scheme, which I'm pleased to say has recently been restored. As Alec Hamilton has recently enthused, Matlock Dale is a sort of epitome of arts and crafts, cosy, pretty, delicate, slightly whimsical, fairy tale, neat, and very unlike the big parish church in town. Now, interestingly, the artist Leonard Squirrel was working with Dawber at this time as an architectural artist, and we know that it was he who did the impressive presentation drawings on the Matlock Chapel for Mrs. Harris. One area which seems to have slipped the memory of architectural historians is Dawber's connection with the Cremation Society of Great Britain, not only during his life, but eccentrically after his death, as the firm of Sir Guy Dawber, Fox and Robinson were designing crematoria well into the 1970s. Of the 40 crematoria built between 1919 and 1939, 25 were by named architects in private practice, with Dawber designing Enfield Crematorium, which opened in 1938, the year of his death, though I would hasten to add that he himself was not committed to the flames. He rather chose to be buried in his parents' grave. But it was in 1935 that he first entered the field, when he was instrumental in drawing up the competition under RIBA rules for Oxford Crematorium. And in 1936, he was appointed by the Tottenham and Wood Green Burial Board to design a building, quote, which would, for their purpose, compare with anything in the country, unquote. And I'm pleased to say he succeeded. The main group consisted of 2 chapels, the cloister, which was also the principal entrance, 2 wings, north and south, containing restrooms, vestries, and lavatories. And the entire group was dominated by a central clock tower. In general, the building could be described as modern traditional. Pleasant, mellow-toned brick was used, with effect both internally as well as externally, with an English pan-tile roof. Now, I did mention a central clock tower, and for those of you who have visited crematoria of the Art Deco period, you would know that that central clock tower really was the chimney for the retorts within the crematorium itself. Dawber's handling bears all the hallmarks of his humane domestic work, once described as possessing a friendly gravity. and there are faint echoes of Romanesque in the round-headed arches of the cloister, a gentle reminder of Dawber's connection with the arts and crafts architect Ernest George. To some extent, Dawber approached the Enfield Commission as if he was designing a single-storey Roman villa, which probably explains that whilst it is a fine building, it looks somewhat wrong for Enfield, whose citizens might well have preferred something Art Deco rather than arts and crafts at that time. The realisation that unregulated development could destroy the countryside that represented England that so many had fought for in the trenches of the Great War triggered a series of appeals to government to take control of the sprawling building boom of the mid-1920s. In 1925, Patrick Abercrombie, president of the Town Planning Institute, urged Neville Chamberlain, who was housing minister at that time, to end ribbon development in the countryside. Dawber wrote an impassionate letter to the Times pleading for immediate steps to be taken to prevent the whole countryside being littered with architectural eyesores. On all sides we hear protests made, but nothing is being done to stop it. Every man is a law unto himself and builds as he wishes with selfish disregard of his neighbour. It's tempting to say little has changed, is it not? But with David, 27th Earl of Crawford and 10th Earl of Balcarres, Dawber founded an organisation called the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, and that was on the 7th of December 1926, of which Dawber was to be its first vice president and chairman. As far as Dawber was concerned, he felt that the new council, which included the National Trust, Women's Institutes, and the Commons Preservation Society, represented a coalition the like of which had never before been brought together for a great common purpose. Early in 1927, the RIBA set up a number of CRPE architecture advisory panels to advise local authorities and developers on good quality design for new buildings. The architect, Clough Williams Ellis, you'll know him as the designer of the village of Portmeria, he published the CRPE Commission book, England and the Octopus, which helped to make urban sprawl a national issue. One of CPRE's early successes led to the Petroleum Consolidation Act of 1928, enabling local authorities to enforce the removal of advertising on and around roadside garages, often located in sensitive tourist destinations and picturesque villages. You'll know the sort of thing. There's huge advertising hoardings on the Hardwick roundabout by the South Gate. Its travelling exhibition, Save the Countryside, which contrasted examples of bad development with positive solutions, visited over 100 towns between 1928 and 1930. And then in November 1929, a spin-off Lake District National Reserve Committee was formed, becoming the Friends of the Lake District in 1934. In the following month, Lord Abercrombie listed 12 distinct areas that might be most suitable for national park status, saying that of the 12 areas given in the list, the High Peaks and the South Downs would appear to have the first claim from the population point of view. From the point of view of national intrinsic beauty, the Lakes, Snowdonia, Exmoor and Dartmoor. And I'm pleased to say central government agreed. And as a result of the Addison Committee, Council for the Preservation of Rural England was asked to draft a countryside bill, which ended up as Sir Edward Hilton Young's Rural Amenities Bill, leading to a reference to the preservation of rural amenities in George V's speech to Parliament. CPRE won support from the Women's Institutes for its suggestion that rural councils must enforce anti-litter bylaws and provide waste bins and waste bin collections to cut down on dumping in hedgerows and ponds, which led to CPRE and the Women's Institutes joining force in setting up the Anti-Litter League to organise litter picks and to educate children on the litter problems. Unfortunately, these problems remain with us today, though I can say that on Saturday last week there was a successful litter pick that took place in Margarets Cemetery. Much of Dawber's time as chairman in 1931 was negotiating with the Ministry of Transport as official advisor to the electricity commissioners on the positioning of overhead electricity cables and to minimise visual impact on the countryside of those large pylons. Today's comparison would be consultation on the impact that wind farms would have on the countryside. But perhaps CPRE's greatest achievement was to promote the Rights of Way Act 1932, which contained powers to make established paths across private land as public rights of way. The restriction of Restrictive Development Act 1935 crowned the CPRE's 9-year campaign against sprawl. Highway authorities were now able to control building within 220 feet of roadsides, and they could also acquire land up to 220 yards from a highway to prevent development. In 1936, when the CPRE celebrated its 10th anniversary, at which period the Times editorial noted that as well as spreading knowledge of beauty, pride in beauty, and the will to preserve beauty, that it had created a growing understanding that the beauty of rural England has a commercial value. Americans and other foreigners come to see it, and they are upset if they find it spoiled. To scoff at amenity is now both old-fashioned and bad business. And those were the words of Guy Dawber. By 1938, the elderly Dawber was feeling the strain of running a busy architectural practice in tandem with being the chairman of CPRE. And it must have been a great relief to him, a few days before he died, on the 24th of April, that Neville Chamberlain appointed Lord Abercrombie as a consultant in the matter where aerodromes and munition factories should be sited, to ensure that other national interests, especially our finest unspoilt scenery, shall receive due consideration before sites are selected. In his earlier years, Dawber had written extensively on vernacular buildings, particularly those in the Cotswolds, Kent and Sussex. At that time, he already had a high profile. As president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, an office he held from 1925 until 1927, the year in which he was somewhat belatedly elected an associate of the Royal Academy. In 1928, he was awarded the RIBA Gold Medal, the first architect with an exclusively domestic practice to be so honoured. Elevation to becoming a full academician came in 1935, followed by a knighthood in 1936. More for the work he did for CPRE, I'm afraid, than for being an architect. 1936 was a year in which he was made a member of the Council of the Royal Academy. Not too bad for a Kingsley lad. Dawber died in London on the 24th of April 1938, and to some extent, I think it's fair to say it was the right time for him to die. The image of the pretty Cotswold cottage, or as far as his patrons were concerned, the extensive Cotswold mansion, had been on the decline. The younger nouveau riche preferring Art Deco to the pretty. Dawber's style was no longer fashionable, and his departure on the eve of the Second World War seems an appropriate time to say farewell to the world. But what was he like? Well, he was a friendly and a genial man, looking more like a country squire than an artist. He seemed to typify in the person the spirit of rural England, which he understood so well. And his charming country houses and gardens invariably melted away into the landscape. Apart from his consummate skill in the English tradition and his sensitive handling of the building crafts, Dawber was an accomplished watercolourist, his sketches showing a luminous quality far removed from prosaic architectural drawings. And for those of us who live in King's Lynn, we can be grateful for Sir Guy Dawber. Admittedly, he had, in general, said farewell to the town when he began his practice in 1890 at Bourton-on-the-Hill in Gloucestershire. We would like to think but he may have had a particular interest in the architectural variety and beauty of the town. It certainly had an effect on him when he was a lad, and we can be grateful that his campaign for the Rights of Way Act of 1932 saw that Friars Walk was preserved as the town's last example of a rural lane. In the 1990s, the historian A.J.P. Taylor said of this town, "In the 1860s, the town was gutting fish, but in the 1960s, the town was gutting itself." One wonders that had Guy Dawber lived just a little longer, he could have convinced the town council to have restored its older buildings rather than have them swept away, only to be replaced by the sort of architecture he so abhorred. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Very interesting. Any questions? I think Julian did, I think in the early 30s, he did come back to Lynn, didn't he, on occasions?
He did indeed, yes.
I read something a long while ago where he was appalled by all those ramshackle buildings outside the South Gate as you come from Salabo Road.
Mm. And
he also complained about the council not caring enough about the guild halls and about the new petrol, the fumes of the growing amount of traffic.
That's quite true, yes. Yeah. He was a great friend, I think, to the historic buildings of this town.
Yeah.
And perhaps it saddened him to see that which he had fought for such a long time under CPRE seemed to be considered by this town to be more for CPRE, Council for the Preservation of Rural.
Yes.
When really it was I'm pleased to say, by the grace of the Town and Country Planning Act, that we find that there are influences of Dawber within that. But yes, as I said, it's a sadness that which he liked about this town was unfortunately that which was lost.
Yeah. Yes. Do you know if he was a member of
SPAB? I don't think he would have been. No. Because I would think that considering CPRE as his baby.
Yeah.
And indeed, in fairness to it, CPRE had far more effect on central government and alteration in central government legislation. Whereas SPAB, he would have thought of as people who used to like to cotton wool buildings, rather than to consider what new builds should be.
Yeah. Yes, and so there's a plaque on the St Margaret's Vicarage, which is about to receive, in a few weeks, a new incumbent, and no doubt you'll be updating the new vicar on the famous place he's living in.
I think he should know the building is gone. If anybody knows what on earth Matthew Dawber did as a merchant, I'm extremely grateful.
A building merchant.
He was a building merchant. Thank you very much for that. Because I couldn't see him recorded in Hill at all as to what it was that he did.
Yeah, I think I've seen adverts and so on, but they were definitely builders merchants.
Right.
And yes, I suppose the plaque is up. He has been more or less forgotten, but of course in a few years' time it'll be the centenary of the SPRE, so that will be an opportunity maybe to make him better known. I don't know how strong in Norfolk. There's a reasonably strong branch, is there? Or
I think that's all. Yes, there is. Very much so. Very much so. And then in 2038, where I'll be long dead, is the centenary of the demise of Dawber himself.
Yeah. And when did you say he was buried?
I found that he was buried in the churchyard of St George's, but St George's where? It doesn't say in the Dictionary of National Biography. Most frustrating.
Yeah. Yes. And any other points, comments, questions?
Just to say, I think you're quite right. We should be proud of him.
Yes, we should.
Thank you for
I think he was a good lad.
Like
Really was. Yes.
I am assuming that Dawber Close is named for him.
I would assume it would be. Yes. Yes, thank you. Whereabouts is Dawber Close?
I don't know. I know the name, and I can't place the where it is. Maybe.
Dawber
Yeah.
Close. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to look up the council minutes at that particular time to see why they chose the name and indeed which councillor recommended it.
Dawber could have been a councillor because Julian mentioned the 1960s and what happened to certain parts of the town. And I think there, in terms of who was involved and the roles they had, I think there also, Julian, there were certain conflicts of interest, which led to demolition. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for an enlightening talk. I'm sure people will talk about it and generate more interest. We need to generate more interest. And I do. It's a pity we can't do a guide, as four of the people here are town guides. We can't do a Guy Dawber walk.
We can't.
We can't.
Well, you could have a Guy Dawber champagne party in the grounds of the vicarage, I suppose.
Yes. I
That'd be
might
nice.
suggest that.
Coach tour.
Quite.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Right.
But Julian, thank you for spending your time and telling us about Dawber. Certainly many things I didn't know. I only had a sketch idea of his life, but I do know he did return to Lynn and wasn't very happy with that out south gate, as they call it. And so thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.